Hey, welcome to 23 Degrees Sideways. We're going to talk a little bit more tonight, this is nighttime as I film this, about paleoconservatism. Now, there's a lot, paleo has become a very popular word in politics. We now have paleoliberals. Paleoliberal is what you would consider to be a 1990s, 1980s Democrat, a classical Democrat. Freedom of speech, as opposed to the modern Democrat who is against freedom of speech, which is kind of a bizarre thing that I still can't get my head around very well. But, freedom of speech, access for minorities, not preferential treatment, just access, welfare state stuff. And it's funny because the welfare state stuff is not something the neoliberals are push as much. They push the programs, but they don't push the idea the same way. They're very different. And look at those differences and pay attention to them. I think that you might learn some stuff if you look at some of those differences. But again, freedom of speech, pro-union, pro-job, pro-American jobs. They were actually very protectionist. So when people say paleoliberalism, they're not talking about classical liberalism, but they're talking about 1950s through early 80s, maybe even up into the early 90s, Democrat. And, Clinton was a neoliberal, but he still had to contend with and deal with what we now call, or what people are now calling, paleoliberals, which I think I just think it's a very interesting and fun term. And that's why you had things like the RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, written the way it was, and so on. We also have paleolibertarianism. Paleolibertarianism is something where I really want to like it, but I can't. All right, this is all leading to paleoconservatism, but paleolibertarianism is a school of thought within American libertarianism, which was founded by Lew Rockwell and Murray Rothbard. So it's very closely associated with the Mises Institute, and it's very much radical libertarianism mixed with strong cultural conservatism and anarcho-capitalism. And so it's it starts with the idea that liberty is the highest political goal of man, but all forms of government intervention should be restricted, nullified, like pretty heavily into the ANCAP side of things. However, what you do is you control your society through conservative social cultural conservatism. So instead of using the government, you use society to put the restrictions and the brakes on and apply the controls. And I really just don't like it. Okay, there's a guy named Brian Boring. He's a anarcho-capitalist that I used to have some entertaining debates with. They were very frustrating because ANCAPs can be really nice, fun people to talk to, but they can also be absolute nightmares of leftist authoritarianism. We had this was a group in Google Plus, and it was pretty much every conversation where I'd ask questions about anarcho-capitalism or say, hey, this doesn't make sense in the real world. How would you apply this in a situation like Saudi Arabia, Yemen? And the answer of course is that if you leave them alone, they'll magically leave you alone, or whatever they were on that day. But whenever there was a disagreement, I was told pretty much every other post that the secret council was allowing me to speak for now, but that I had to watch myself because I was on thin ice. And I wasn't being particularly rude, I was just being very firm, with some hard questions. And that to me is the problem with paleolibertarianism. Secret councils allowing you for now. one of the arguments on there was about a neighbor. I have a neighbor. She's that way. She's really just not a nice person. Very nasty. Constant water wars because we share an irrigation channel, and there's issues there, and she causes problems all up and down this irrigation district, this mile of road, and so the NCAP answer is, since there's no public roads, it's all private property, is to deny her access to any property that leaves her farm until she either dies or caves in and goes with the group agreement. And I'm just like, whoa, that is harsh, man. That is full on absolute Black Lives Matter Antifa crap. So anyway, I realize, and here I'm doing the thing where I'm halfway an ANCAP myself, except that I'm not quite, because of the edges versus society thing. I would love to be a paleo-libertarian if it wasn't for the ANCAP part, because I think that conservative government values and conservative government function in the classical liberal sense would actually work really well, and that's not minarchism. But anyway, Jeffersonian libertarianism, which is pretty social, but I'm not trying to pick on them, because again, voluntarism, there's a lot of stuff I really like and admire, but there's some issues, and the paleo-libertarian movement seems to be right smack in the middle of that particular place. So don't really go for that one, which is a shame, because I would really love it. Okay, I would really love paleo-libertarianism to work for me. When I first heard the word several years ago, I thought, oh, this is going to be great. But as with many other things, not so much. And this brings us back to paleoconservatism. The thing about this word paleo is it's been thrown on a bunch of stuff as the definition of paleoconservative changes, because paleoconservative wasn't a common word up until some Fox News guy made it a common word, basically. And at that point in time, the definition really started to change. So what you have at a very early stage of what became paleoconservatism is the land movement in England. All right, and along with that, you had Bolton Hall, who was an activist in the United States. He was Irish, actually. And you had some other movements in here. There were a lot of Catholics. 3 acres and a cow is a very Catholic thing, actually, from the land movement in England. And the idea of a lot of that was very definitely social cultural conservatism. That is an absolute bedrock of the paleoconservative idea. Very much so. That's something that even Wikipedia casts it in a harsh and negative light, but it is there, okay? And I think that that's fine. I think that it's value. As I get more into my comfort with my space, I get much more into the idea that society, as long as society provides the outlets for people who don't fit, that it's a really good idea for most of society to have a relatively conservative basis of structure. And I say relatively conservative. Most people do well with a kind of conservatism. That's one of the problems we're having with progressives right now. Progressives and the authoritarian left in the United States, the radical, regressive wing of the Democratic Party, they're called progressives, but they're very regressive. They are very... realistically, they're very socially conservative. They are the absolute pinnacle of conformist thought in the United States. for all that they claim that they're not, they really are. You must believe like them or they will cancel you. Lately, they've taken to wandering the streets trying to force people to give a salute, to show public support for them. It's very Nazi. It's really bad. It's straight out of a National Socialist playbook, which is not unexpected because the progressives were essentially allied with the ideas of National Socialism and fascism until they weren't, or until they claimed not to be. Early on, there was a lot of cross-pollination. Anyway, this isn't about progressivism or its history. 3 acres and a cow. I bring that back a lot because it's funny because it's part of the land movement. The slogan is part of the land movement in England, which is a foundational aspect of paleoconservatism, I think, but it's not actually paleoconservatism. Bolton Hall was an American activist. He was Irish. He was an American lawyer, and he worked he worked with the poor, and he was kind of socialist, but he wasn't socialist in the sense that we understand it now. He was actually voluntarist. His socialism was very much voluntary, and he was in the Longshoremen's Union in New York, and he started a foundation where they bought some land, and they had one land tax for people, and there was common gardening, and it was very much an idea of individual ownership and work. So that's the whole thing. So he did vacant lot gardening, which was an idea of using free land or using unused land for people to build their own gardens, to be a little more self-sufficient. And that led to the Little Land League, and they bought property. They did eventually buy a piece of property and develop a place where you would get your land, start your farm, pay a single tax, a simplified single tax structure, and it was based on the value of the land, not production or anything else. It was a pretty interesting concept. So this is Bolton Hall, and he founded the New York's Tax Reform Association. There's a whole bunch of other stuff in there, but he's a key figure in what became paleoconservatism, but he's not really recognized as such because he was actually more or less a progressive socialist in some ways. He was more on the Jeffersonian socialism side of things. As you can see, the goal of his social movements, social activity, was to provide the yeomanry, a independent system of wealth generation, control of capital. This is, again, one of those key elements that I think is left out of the ideas of paleoconservatism. And at this point, it doesn't matter because paleoconservatism has been changed to something that is basically neoconservatism on steroids. So I'm probably going to drop it after this. But I wanted to actually make the point that before we talk about Catholic, Latin Mass Catholics and such, that paleoconservatism has a history that comes from a couple different areas. So conservative values, again, your Latin Mass Catholics, conservative values, very, very, very strongly conservative, but also with a little bit of William James pragmatism thrown in, where the goal is to make it workable, not to make it extremist. That's kind of a key difference. Paleoconservatism also does have as a foundational element that idea of independence. Independence of production, independence of your labor, your production, your capital. And this is the thing where I think that there's a hidden legacy that could be extremely positive for all of us, and that is that foundational idea there that you must have ownership of your own means of production, ownership of your own capital, your own means of production, your own land, whatever it is. Agrarian yeomanry is a nice concept in the late 1700s when Jefferson is talking about America. It's not such a great concept right now. Although it's not invalid, it's just there's a lot more to it than that, and we need a digital or a post-industrial yeomanry, and that doesn't mean that the farmer is out, because we definitely need to get back to individual farmers instead of large farm corporations. Large, I'm not talking about the family corporation that owns 7 farms. That's not large. We're talking about ConAgra, stuff like that. So that's a thing. I just wanted to give a little history, and this wasn't a very good history, was it? Little discussion about where this all comes from. There was a land movement, and the idea was that people need to have the freedom and control of their own means of production, their own means of sustenance. And I think that is the best takeaway of early paleoconservatism that people really need to focus on moving forward. People talk about a society of abundance, but it's not a society of abundance if you don't control it. Okay? That's really kind of a big deal. So, ownership and control of your own means of production. It's right up there in my top 10 list of things that we need that are foundation core aspects. Government must treat everyone fairly. Life is not fair, but government must be fair to be valid. Government's purpose is to protect individual liberty. Primary purpose is to protect individual liberty. And that's not a short-sighted thing. That does mean sometimes you have to fight wars to protect individual liberty. Third, in order to do that, in order to have a free citizenry, government needs to act on this guarantee, this preservation of control and ownership of one's own means of production. That's it. We're up to 3. See if we can get to 10. Stay sideways. Have a good one. Talk to you soon.